Hi there, thank you for being with us today. We're going to be talking about Mad Men, the TV show, and who owns the insight in terms of strategy, power, and creative influence, both in the show and then also in real life marketing scenarios. I am Janna, and we have Madison, Sandra, and Yubeen joining us today for this presentation.
Across our assigned episodes, strong advertising ideas often begin with observation, instinct, or lived experience, but they get reshaped as they move through organizational hierarchy. Modern advertising theory suggests that creative briefs are designed to protect this process. They clearly define the target audience, consumer insight, objective, message, and tone to keep strategy aligned with research and intent. However, this raises an important question. Does a creative brief actually protect insight, or does agency power still decide what counts as strategy? In Mad Men, Sterling Cooper is strong at identifying consumer insight, but less effective at protecting where or from whom that insight came. As ideas move upward, they're often reinterpreted or reattributed, showing how ownership of ideas blurred inside the agency structure.
So, starting this off strong in episode 2 from the first season, the Right Guard campaign shows an example of the difference between knowing what the product does and understanding the consumer problem behind it. So, Right Guard is a very simple product, of course, it prevents sweating, but in advertising theory, the product feature is not always the real persuasion point, and the appeal is why the audience is supposed to care about that. So, in this case, Sterling Cooper is not really talking about dryness by itself. They're turning perspiration into a social risk, where the fear is not just sweating, but being noticed sweating. That's actually a really strong strategic move because they're taking a functional benefit and connecting it to an emotional consequence. The problem is that emotional consequence is being interpreted through the wrong lens. The product is used by men, but the campaign depends on women's approval, which means the target audience is more layered than just men who need deodorant. There is the user, the buyer, and the person whose opinion gives the product social meaning. Sterling Cooper recognizes that women matter to the purchase situation, but they treat that as kind of a clever observation instead of a basic audience question. Rather than studying women as consumers, they build the campaign around assumptions about what women do for the men in their lives. And that's where the insight kind of starts to break down. The agency gets close to a useful consumer truth, but because the room is dominated by men, the female perspective is flattened into nothing more than a tool for selling male confidence instead of a real audience with their own uniquely held motivations. So this is not a case of old advertising is sexist, even though that is obvious part of the conversation here. Rather, that a bad audience definition can corrupt an otherwise decent insight. When the audience is imagined instead of research, the campaign can still sound persuasive, but being built on a weaker version of the consumer than it could be. That connects to our larger argument because Sterling Cooper does land on something real here. They understand that the product has emotional stakes attached, but the people with authority still decide what that emotion means in its entirety.
Belgioly is one of the cleaner case studies Mad Men gives us, because it lets us see exactly where the insight originates and exactly where it stops belonging to the person who found it. The setup is in the episode during the lipstick focus group. Freddie walks out of it convinced he understands the consumer. His read is that women want lots and lots of colors. As the Journal of Consumer Psychology explains in its review of the choice overload in 2014, large assortments can make decisions harder when the options are complex, difficult to compare, or personally uncertain. Lipstick fits that logic in that more shades don't automatically make the purchase more persuasive, because most of them won't work for the person looking at them. Freddie sees volume and calls it value. It's Peggy who identifies the actual emotional backbone of the purchase. The campaign shouldn't be built around how many shades exist. It should be built around the experience of finding the one that feels like yours. That reframe from abundance to personal selection becomes the strategic core of the Belle Jolie pitch. Dawn tells the client that no woman wants to be one in a box of 100, but instead wants the gift of total ownership. The idea works because it gives women a sense of ownership over the product rather than just access to it. Because Peggy doesn't automatically have the standing to own what she observes, the insight has to travel upward through the agency before it can be recognized as strategy. And in that movement, the distance between the person who generated the idea and the person who gets credited for it becomes very wide. She becomes a copywriter, but the promotion still proves the point in that her insight only gains institutional value once the men above her recognize it. This is the structural problem the episode is actually about. It's not just that Peggy is underestimated, and she is, but Sterling Cooper doesn't have an official process that connects insight to origin. There's no mechanism in place that asks, where did the understanding of this consumer come from, and whose perspective made it possible? Modern standards force a team to commit to a consumer insight before the creative work starts. And an observation that's documented as the strategic foundation is a lot more difficult to quietly absorb into someone else's read of the consumer than one that just surfaces in a meeting and gets picked up by whoever has the most authority to run with it.
In episode 12 from the first season, Nixon versus Kennedy, Sterling Cooper takes this a step further when they treat the political candidates the same way it would treat a product with an image problem. Nixon isn't really discussed in this episode as a political figure with a platform to communicate. He's discussed as a brand that reads poorly to the public, and the agency job is to figure out which version of him is sellable. The questions on the table aren't really about policy, they're about perception. What's making voters uncomfortable, what can be softened, and what can be pushed forward to create a more positive impression. That's positioning in a very technical sense. Positioning is about controlling what meaning attached to the product in the audience's mind before the audience has time to form its own conclusions. A 2022 study in Frontier in Psychology found that political ads work by building support through emotional appeals and stereotypic framing around candidates, opponents, and policy issue, and that's exactly what Stalin Cooper is doing here. Nixon and Kennedy aren't being evaluated with the way a voter might study two candidates carefully. They are being handled the way a consumer handles two familiar brands, on the basis of image and feeling rather than detail. The connection to our larger argument is that the agency's power in this episode comes from something that happened before any creative work starts. Someone has to decide what problem this campaign is actually solving, and that decision shapes everything that follows. In this episode, the framing happens through pure confidence rather than research, which means the campaign direction gets set by whoever in the room is most persuasive, not by any real evidence about what voters are actually responding to. A modern creative brief would force the team to ground the strategy in something beyond the room. Before the positioning gets decided, someone has to demonstrate through hard data who the target audience actually is, and what the communication is supposed to accomplish. Without that, the campaign reflects what the agency decided it could sell, which in this episode means it reflects whoever had the confidence to define the platform first.
Following a major crisis, Don Draper rejects a defensive approach and reframes the brand through the idea of quote-unquote the front ear, positioning American Airlines as forward-moving rather than focused on damage control. According to Nortimo 2026, from a marketing perspective, crisis advertising must first protect credibility before it can reposition a brand. A forward-looking message only works if the audience believes the company has earned permission to move on. In modern practice, a creative brief is supposed to ensure that this strategic framing is grounded in research, audience insight, and client objective. However, Mad Men shows a different reality. Don's senior authority allows him to define the strategic frame in the room, even when that frame is not directly tied back to documented insight. Critically, Sterling Cooper treats approval from leadership as validation of strategy itself, rather than validating it through structured research or process. We see a clear hierarchy: client pressure at the top, followed by senior leadership, then the creative director, and finally junior insight and research at the base.
So our answer is yes, and the evidence is in what Sterling Cooper consistently gets wrong. Across every episode we've looked at, the strategy gets defined before the consumer has really been accounted for. The insights either comes from the wrong read of the audience, gets observed by someone with more authority, or gets locked in under pressure before anyone tests whether it holds. The brief interrupts the sequence by forcing those questions to be answered up front, in writing, before the pitch starts doing the work that research should have done. That doesn't mean the brief is a guaranteed fix. A document doesn't redistribute power on its own, but it does change what the idea has to prove, and it changes when that proof is required. In every case we've examined, the problem wasn't that Sterling Cooper lacked creativity, it's that creativity was being used to substitute for strategy rather than execute it.
So if we take all of these episodes into account, the bigger pattern here is that Mad Men makes advertising looks like it runs on creative genius alone, but there's a deeper issue of strategic control at play here. The real question isn't who has the best idea, it's who gets to turn their interpretation of the consumer into strategy that everyone else just has to follow. So the first takeaway is about how ideas are evaluated. In Mad Men, ideas often come from convincing, through charisma, rank, client reaction, so the pitch itself starts to function like a proof of concept. Under modern standards, that's exactly what a creative brief is supposed to challenge. The brief gives a standard beyond the presenter to hold to, and that idea still has to sound good, of course, but it also has to prove it belongs in the strategy through research and through idea testing. The second takeaway is about audience construction. In the show, the audience is not always treated as something to be researched carefully. A lot of the time, the audience is shaped by whatever version of it makes the pitch work. Right Guard needs women to act as judges of male acceptability. The Nixon and Kennedy campaign treats voting like a normal consumer choice. People compare options and rely on cues they already recognize instead of looking deeper. Belle Jolie needs women's personal choice to become a sellable product insight, and American Airlines needs the public to be ready to move forward before anyone has really proven that they are ready to move forward. That's why research and segmentation are so crucial and why we're pushing on this point for the presentation. These things aren't just time wasters that we have to complete before the creative part takes place. They are safeguards against campaigns that sound sharp in the room but are strategically weak, especially if they depend on the version of the consumer that the agency has basically invented in the moment. The third takeaway is about creative brief. The brief is not important because it makes the process more organized in an administrative way. It's important because it controls interpretation. It forces a team to define what the problem is that they're solving before a room starts rewarding the most confident version of that idea. And that's why the brief changes the power dynamic. In Mad Men, authority can make an idea feel settled just by being delivered by Dawn. In a stronger modern process, the idea still has to prove that it fits the agreed strategy, which does not remove creativity, but it does make creativity answerable to something beyond a cult of personality. So the final thought for us is this. The interest of Mad Men depends on strategy staying loose. That looseness gives the show its drama because one person can walk into a room and make a campaign feel as if it's meant to arrive packaged and delivered, fully formed. But from a marketing perspective, loose strategy is also where risk lives. When the consumer, the insight, and the objective can all keep shifting, a campaign can drift away from what the problem was supposed to solve. And from that point of view, a real test of good strategy is whether it still answers the consumer after the pitch is over.